Welcome everyone to this episode of Fishology. We have a very special episode for you guys. We also have our very first guest ever on Fishology. I want to welcome on Geoff Pontes from Baseball America. Geoff, thank you so much for coming on to Fishology.
Thanks a lot, man. I'm excited to be on and also honored that I'm your first guest.
Yeah, of course.
Welcome you with open arms.
For those of you who may not know, in Fishology here, we like to go in depth in stats and advanced stats. Look away from maybe the traditional stats and just really go in depth about players from the Marlins. And before we start our very first prospect episode, let's give a warm welcome to Louis and Adam. How are you guys feeling for this podcast?
I'm excited, definitely to further enlighten our audience with Geoff here about obviously like different ways of evaluating prospects and kind of what makes a prospect. And yeah, I'm definitely excited to have Geoff on.
Yeah, and I'm definitely excited to kind of look into some of these extra prospects we've got here, some of the top guys the Marlins are looking forward to having as part of their cornerstones going into, the future, the latter half of the decade. So love to see what guys like Eury, Eder, and some of these guys bring to the store and break them down and talk about them.
Yeah, and let's just start with the number one overall prospect, the cream of the crop for the Marlins, Mr. Eury Pérez, who is only 19 years old and looks like a future ace for the Marlins. This past season in Double-A, he posted a 4.08 ERA in 17 games started in 75 innings. Maybe not the best in terms of ERA looking for Eury Pérez, but he was on a pitching limit around 70, but still it is throwing, top tier for the Marlins. And Geoff, I want to get your whole perspective on Eury and maybe what the Marlins have there with the 19-year-old.
Yeah, and I think you have to keep in mind like how young Eury was for the level. I mean, he was 18 years old. He turned 19 the 15th of April, so the second week or whatever the season. He effectively would have been, a high school draft pick had he been American. I think when you put that into perspective, the fact that he was in Double-A, pitching in similar environments to where top college picks were getting blown up out of the draft, where top college picks had to pitch well in high A to even get to that level. If you look at a guy like Gordon Graceffo, I mean, we shoved him onto a top 100 list. Cardinals fans are excited about him. He's, like 3 years older than Eury, 4 years older than Eury. And we think it's impressive when he gets to Double-A. So I think when you think about that and just the type of situations that the Marlins were trying to put Eury into, they were consistently challenging him. And that even goes back to spring training. I was at a backfield game, a Double-A game, actually. This is the video right here where he faced a Mets lineup that included Robinson Cano. Sterling Marte sat in for an at-bat because he was coming back off of the IL and was playing in the AAA game on the other side of the complex. Jeff McNeil was in this lineup. He struck out Jeff McNeil actually in this game. Like I said, Robinson Cano, Mark Canha was in this game, as well as Eduardo Escobar. So there were like a handful of major leaguers, and this guy's in here. He's getting swings and misses on this fastball. He's tunneling the slider right off of that, which doesn't have like huge sweep, but it's really hard and it has like late cut, so it's really effective. He's showing the curveball. The changeup's pretty good as well. I mean, overall, when you look at the fact that this is a guy who is as young as he is, he's as big and as long as he is, he moves as well as he is, he's as synced up as well as he is. It's remarkable. And then you start to dig under the hood. You look at stuff. He sat 97 miles per hour this year. Per TrackMan. He's been up to 100. As a starter. The fastball has ride. It has bore, so meaning it has arm side run and it has ride. And he has high spin rates that are efficient. So when I say that, I mean he's 2,500, 2,600 RPMs on his fastball, which is elite. And he's getting movement out of that and velocity. So like that combination of traits, and even his release height, like he's a sub 5 VAA guy, and we could talk about some of these metrics and what they mean, but just in terms of the plane on a fastball, 5 is pretty standard. Like that's what I would consider to be like generic. Bigger guys, of course, are typically going to have a steeper plane in their fastball. The fact that he gets down the mound as well as he does, extends as well as he does, and is able to create that flatter plane in his fastball with the velocity, with the movement, like that combination of traits is good if you're 5'11". If you're 6'8" and you're able to do all that, it's really unique. There's probably even more power that could come out of this body. Like if you look at him, he's built sort of like, a first round draft pick out of college that plays power forward. And you're like, that guy's going to add 30, 40 pounds of muscle over the next several years. Like he's built like that, and then you look at the secondaries. I mean, he's got a hard slider. I guess it doesn't have a ton of movement, but it sort of has that late cut, more of your like prototypical sort of gyro slider. He's got a curveball that is more of like a horizontal curveball. I think it's really more like release, kind of makes it look like it has more depth than it actually has. And he's got a good changeup. I mean, he throws all these pitches for strikes. He lands them in zone. He gets ground balls at around a 50% rate or higher against all of his secondaries. His changeup actually has like a 64% ground ball rate. So he's got a variety of ways to get guys out. He can get guys to swing and miss. He can land all of his pitches for strikes. He doesn't really have anything that moves like crazy, like this DL Hall stuff where, yeah, it's phenomenal, but like getting that in the zone consistently is difficult. And getting guys to swing, I think that's part of it, right? Is like you need to have pitches that play off of each other that trick guys into swinging in or out of the zone. Swings are good, it turns into outcomes. And more often than not, if you don't have incredibly hittable stuff, you're going to get out. So, I look at a guy like Eury and it's like the sky's the limit, but he checks all the different boxes. I think the biggest question for me is like that body type, health. We saw some health stuff at the end of the year. But, if he comes back strong next year and we see, 120 to 130 innings, we may even see him in the major leagues if that's the case. But there's no reason for them to rush him. I think this is, of all the arms that they've had, all the pitchers they've had over the last few years, and they've obviously developed some good ones, this might be the most special guy. I don't think it's that close, really. And I really liked like Edward Cabrera. I like Max Meyer. I think, Pablo Lopez is very good, right on down the board. But this is going to be, if he comes up and is what he is, like it's going to be bigger than when guys saw Sixto in that 2020 season. And it seemed like the first 5 starts of Sixto Sanchez's career, he was, going to be whatever, like the next Pedro Martinez or something.
Yeah, no, with Eury Pérez, like he was my top prospect on the Marlins. Personally, I have him, Jeff, as my second overall pitching prospect behind Andrew Painter, just simply because I love the stuff with Painter. His strikeout percentage is a little bit higher. Conversely, his walk percentage is a little bit lower. He consistently throws 100 miles an hour more often, I believe, than Eury. Correct me if I'm wrong with that. Just in his secondary is a little bit better. So I do believe that I know Eric Longenhagen has Eury as a 65. I'll have Andrew as my 65. But Eury Pérez, you can't go wrong with him. Absolutely. He's just absolutely stellar. He's got that elite 4-pitch mix, standing at that 6'9" frame, throwing 96 to 98 consistently, flashing those triple digits with that fastball and getting decent ride with it. The changeup I thought was really like an underrated pitch. Is something that I kind of wish he would throw more often, and it would make his sequencing a lot better with that, like I mentioned, with that advanced 4-pitch mix. Jeff mentioned his gyro slider. He gets a lot of swings and misses with that. It kind of sits in the mid 80s. But that curveball is really, really nice. And I believe it has a lot of slurvy tendencies to it because it kind of has more of like a little break than I think a traditional curveball would. But, make no mistake, Jeff mentioned everything here about the makeup of really being an ace caliber starter. And in my opinion, once he gets all said and done, he's probably going to be taking over Sandy as that number 1 guy in the rotation, just because simply he's going to be getting outs, and he's the guy who's going to be getting that guaranteed out more than Sandy, who's going to be relying on batted ball and weak contact. So that's why I do like Eury Pérez, and he's the future ace of this ball club if all goes well, and obviously if he doesn't get hurt, and we've seen injury risk, but make no mistake, he's already showing like the polish of a back-end rotation starter as a teenager right now. So barring any setbacks, he'll be in the major leagues next year, and he's going to be something very special.
Yeah. Lewis, let me ask you really quick, Yuri. You talk a lot with our prospect coverage with Alex. A lot of stuff there. We're always talking to him. Just what do you see from Yuri, and maybe especially for 2023?
I mean, Geoff mentioned the tunneling with the slider and, the ability to command the changeup. Like, obviously, we understand that to be a successful starting pitcher, whether that's a mid rotation guy or somebody like Eury who has front of the rotation potential, commanding three pitches is important. And we've seen the scouting grades. Obviously, I think he has three pitches that are 55 and above. The fastball and the slider are 65, if I'm not mistaken. The question I wanted to ask Geoff, though, was because he, given he was facing guys so much older than him or a couple years older than him at Double A, and he will likely start there next year because obviously he missed some time at the end of the year due to injury. Do you think the Marlins pitching depth at the big league level had the way it's manifested itself with the likes of Sandy, Braxton, Cabrera and Pablo and the myriad of other guys that they've had come up and do well for them? Do you think that's a net positive for Eury and that they can continue to take their time with him given his youth? He's not going to be 20 until mid-April of next year. Or could we even see a spot where maybe the end of 2023 where he's kind of coming out of the bullpen in like a Chris Sale way where he just to kind of get his feet wet at the major league level? Because we know the stuff, you could likely put him in the big leagues tomorrow, as we saw from the backfield film against the Mets. He could get big league hitters out. I mean, striking out a guy like Jeff McNeil, who almost never strikes out. He's, a player in the 80s playing nowadays. But at the end of the day, does the depth hurt him, or is it a positive to further his development to where they can kind of push him along at a rate that the Dodgers did with, say, like a Julio Urias, who is a different kind of pitcher, but because they assembled such a pitching depth on their own end, he's kind of blossomed in a way that they've maybe thought he would manifest himself. Your thoughts on that, though, with as far as like his timeline and whether or not, him coming to the big leagues sooner rather than later would be a good or bad thing for us?
Yeah, no, I think it'd be a good thing. And, at the end of the day, I think having other guys who have, had similar experiences, especially when you do have a guy like, Sandy Alcantara, who had expectations from two different fan bases. And then, was able to obviously, reach the top of the mountain in terms of becoming a Cy Young starter. Like that's what it is. So I think having guys like that as a mentor, especially when he is a bigger guy, I think that's great. There's other guys who speak a lot of Spanish. I met Eury and, certainly, is learning English, but like Spanish is his first language. That's what he's comfortable with. I would understand if I went to another country where, all my teammates didn't speak English. I could totally understand the comfort there. And I think that Miami has like that sort of culture. They've done a good job on the pitching side. It's a good ballpark to pitch in in general if you're a pitcher. So, I think that it's a good thing. They can slow roll them if needed. That said, there's never enough pitching depth. And if this is another guy who can provide innings, and the pitching staff is going well, and he pitches well enough, not only back in Pensacola, but but also in Jacksonville. Like if he goes up AAA and shoves, like there's no reason not to bring him up to the major leagues. And if it isn't a bullpen role, or even like you have some of these bullpen games where he's a guy that could go 3 or 4 innings. There's probably some value in that down the stretch, just in terms of, having innings and if he's a guy that, you decide to add to the 40-man, et cetera. So there's some things sort of working against them there in terms of that, like ultimately being the case in 2023. But I'm sure that he's going to be in big league camp. He's going to be around those guys. They're going to have him like having conversations with, different big league guys, building relationships. Teams do all that stuff in the back end, just so it's a lot easier, especially with a prospect like Eury, that when he does finally sort of reach the major leagues, that it's not like he's coming in totally blind and sort of like, alienated by the fact that he's a rookie.
Yeah, Geoff, for Eury, as maybe we're finishing up with him, we get to the next prospect. Just who does he profile to you in the majors? Is there, when you see Eury, is there a comparison that really jumps out to you when you see him pitch in Double A?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Because like I think you see, I actually have Andrew Painter number one too, but when I see Painter, like it's like all right, it's like Verlander, like it's like that hoppy fastball. He can land the slider off of it. He's got a curveball, wants to throw a changeup. Like just in terms of like how everything works, like it's just very much there. Just how many guys in the major leagues are this big and have this kind of velocity? Because I think that's the other thing is when you look at a lot of bigger pitchers historically, they're not necessarily always the hardest throwers. It's more like guys who were ground ball pitchers that created downhill plane and would sort of beat you like that, right? So it's hard to come up with like an exact comp. Sort of like thinking about it off like the top of my head, I'm like trying to come up with somebody that like tunnels really well. Like I guess like Glasnow is one guy because like the way his slider moves and the fastball, he gets a little bit. He doesn't cut his fastball like Glasnow does, but he's a bigger guy. He hasn't had the command issues Glasnow has. Like I think in terms of like how they throw and like how ultimately Glasnow found success, it's probably similar. Big like lanky guy, you'd probably think like Tristan McKenzie, but like he's much better than Tristan McKenzie ever was. It's really hard. Like I can't think of too many pitchers that were this size that had this kind of stuff, and there's just not many starters in general that sit 97 miles an hour. They could probably do it fairly easily. There's only a handful of guys, even in the majors, as starters that do that. I mean, you're talking McClanahan, Ohtani, Sandy Alcantara, Garrett Cole, Dylan Cease is probably there, Corbett Burns. So, I mean, it's a rare group. I could say Logan Gilbert, he kind of has a similar skill set, but he's better than Gilbert. I mean, I don't think that's a question.
As we finish up with Eury, Adam, Lewis, anything you guys want to mention before we move on, or anything you want to ask Geoff as we go on to our next prospect?
For me, I'm ready to go on to the next guy. I've got notes here. I mean, Lewis, anything you wanted to ask and talk about? Anything else?
No, I think we've waxed poetic on Eury enough to where we can wait until he's dominating Rhys Hoskins and co. Later next year to have further discussions about him.
So for our next prospect we're going to talk about, we go from pitching, we're going to go to hitting. For the Marlins, who they drafted last season with the 6th overall pick, Mr. Jacob Berry from LSU. Struggled a bit coming into rookie ball, was still just getting used to it, but then turning around when he got to single A Jupiter with a 750 OPS, 264. Just was one of the best hitters in the SEC last season. But there are questions about if he could play the field defensively because he did spend a lot of time DHing and then splitting time in his time LSU between DH and third base. Geoff, what do you see Jacob Berry as a prospect? And just is this really going to be a really long developmental for Berry until he's finally major league ready?
I don't think it's going to necessarily be a long path. I just think the expectations have to be reset a little bit about what he's going to ultimately be. I don't think there's any chance he's going to be a third baseman. I think it's a 0% chance he's going to be a third baseman. I would, at this point, I'd probably move him to first, try to get him to stick there. He's not a very good fielder. He's a pretty well below average athlete, which obviously isn't great. He's a switch hitter with contact skills, approach, and some power. It's not like drop your jaw kind of power, but it's solidly 55. I think you could probably, if you're optimistic about him, you could project the 60 power. I think that's what Josh Norris has on it, who does our Marlins coverage. A lot of scouts that like Jacob Berry will have 60 on it. I don't know. I'll be honest. Like I'm probably the lowest guy in the public space on Jacob Berry. It's just not my kind of profile. I tend to shy away from switch hitters in general, unless there's up the middle defense that kind of goes with it, and it's all right. switch hitting power hitters, it's a long path typically. He's pretty polished. I mean, it's just I don't know. I don't know how much better this profile gets. It's just like he'd have to improve skills, which doesn't often happen with guys who are pretty high skilled. Or he'd have to get to more game power. And I think some of that is just probably letting loose a little bit in the approach. And the approach is one of the things that makes him really good. So I think this could be an everyday, average regular at first base or DH, solid average, kind of like your 280, 20 home run guy with, like a 10 to 12% walk rate. Gets a little bit above average. He doesn't do anything incredibly well, but he does everything well at the plate. Professional hitter, all that sort of stuff. Your announcers will love him when he's at the plate. He'll go the other way sometimes. But I mean, he's not the kind of like impact bat from college you're hoping to get in the top 10, in my opinion. Now, I could be proven wrong. I could, like I said, I'm lower on Jacob Berry than other people are. Certainly Josh's reporting came back more optimistic than the people I've spoken with. But by and large, it seemed like he was a pretty divisive prospect, depending upon the scouts you were talking to and depending upon the analysts you were talking to leading up to the draft.
Yeah, and for me, I'm right with you on that, Geoff. And personally speaking, the kind of profile like you mentioned, I personally don't feel like it's warranted being selected as high as it is. Like your hit and your power tools have to be Spencer Torkelson good, at least in my opinion, to be selected as high. And even now, you're seeing Torkelson, the caveats of a selection like that, because with your hit, when your hit and your power go down, there's nothing to leverage your value and your WAR because you're not a good runner. You're not a fielder and you can't throw because you're a first base DH profile. So when that goes down the flusher, there's nothing to help you. Even with Berry, like you mentioned, the hit tool and the power tools weren't noisy enough for me to warrant a selection at number 6. I mean, like there are obviously things that he brings to the table. Specifically as a switch hitter, I think he is advanced as a hitter. I think he's a better hitter from the right side than he is from the left, and he has very quick hands, being able to turn on the pitches. And he does make very advanced swing decisions for his age. He played in the SEC, arguably one of the better conferences in college baseball, if not the best. Had plus power with, I think he's got an easily capability to hit 25 or more homers a season, as long as that kind of the barrel accuracy keeps up with his hand and bat speed. But like you mentioned, Geoff, there really isn't beyond that a lot to talk about with Berry. I mean, I kind of thought, maybe he has an outside shot at staying a third. I'll take your word for it if you're going to tell me that he has absolutely no chance. Because that's pretty much what the consensus in the industry is, that he'll eventually slide across the diamond, if not off the field altogether, at the DH role. They're still trying to develop him at third. Obviously, it's not really working. It's really those latter 3 tools that really limit his profile and his potential value. And I personally don't buy the power and the hit tool enough to be picked as high as he did. I personally really liked a guy like Cam Collier at number 6. I think it was one of the Crawford brothers, not Crawford brothers, someone out there. He was a draft pick. Somebody else. He was a very, very talented guy. It was a Phillies pick, if I remember this year. But
that's Carl Crawford. So
Carl Crawford. Yeah. He was his little brother. Justin Crawford. Yeah. So those were all players I like, not to get too off topic, but yeah, it's with Berry, I like what I see at the plate, but other than that, it's there's not a whole lot to leverage it. So he's really running on thin ice as a prospect if he's losing his ability to hit, is to hit for power as well.
Yeah. Lewis, same thing, but how do you see Jacob Berry maybe transitioning to the majors when that does happen? Who knows how long that's going to be, 2-3 years from now?
Personally, I think they just drafted Nick Castellanos transposed to college. When you talk about the lack of a defensive profile, I believe right after he signed, we were on site to cover a game. It was a Sunday game, and he was taking ground balls at third base. And again, you can gauge that how you will. And I know a lot of prospects they'll use game data, and then they'll just kind of see how they go about things in practice to kind of make their decisions about one's ability at a respective position. And you can kind of see the physicality of him reminds me of Castellanos in the sense that he almost looks like he's too big to be playing third base. And the arm itself Like, it looked like he was just struggling to make throws across the diamond. I don't even want to imagine what like savant data says about like his arm strength in the minor leagues thus far, though I'm sure, Jeff, you may have something on that we don't. Yeah, I think maybe that like the Marlins, and they kind of did this with Blade, and this was maybe the kind of opinion that I was under, the guys that I was under when they drafted him, and that drafting a college bat, while yes, it's true that if you do go to college, you're likely to face better competition, and it's better for overall player development, whether you're a pitcher or a position player. I think maybe like the Marlins brass and scouting department, and I could be 100% wrong, maybe went with a pick like Barry in the first round, in that knowing he's a college bat, knowing he did it at two different schools, was it Arizona and LSU, the fact that he produced offensively was enough for them to maybe say like, okay, like this is a guy that could go through the system quickly, and relative to where our pitching kind of is, we think that he could maybe establish himself, like you said, as maybe an auxiliary or a complementary big league player in the midst of what hopes to be a competitive team because of what they have in the rotation and what they're maybe hoping to get with some of the other guys, in the infielders and the minors. But yeah, I think you're kind of just like where they are with their position player development. It's so like low on the totem for like guys to be excited about. Do you kind of just hold
here's
out for
the pitch I was there for.
Manifest? Exactly, with Don Mattingly taking the throws at first. Do you kind of just wait for the bat to manifest and hope that like maybe the defense resolves itself at some position, whether that's corner outfield or third base? Because I mean, I'm looking at like a negative 15 DRS third baseman if you put him in the big leagues like tomorrow. Like, it's just the profile there doesn't look great, and we'll have more data to go off of defensively as this season, as 2023 kind of comes around, and the organization maybe gets a better idea what to do with them. But yeah, I think you're just maybe holding out for the bat and thinking that he'll develop quickly, because we saw, like you pointed out, Jeff and Adam, he's got plate discipline, and like that's something that like you can't necessarily just teach. There's guys in the big leagues who have been productive big leaguers for reasons beyond their ability to take walks, but a skill set like that I think is important, and I think that, like I said, would make him a nice complementary piece. But I don't think that he's a player of a caliber that you would merit taking where they did $6 million for somebody who profiles to be an average big leaguer. I don't know, like as a draft pick in the first round, like that's just something I can't rest comfortably with, knowing that they did that.
Yeah, and Jeff, when you look back at that draft class, especially for the Marlins, I don't want to armchair quarterback it, but hindsight's always 20/20. But when you look at it, is there a way you would have gotten? Because looking at the names now and the way they're producing, there's guys like Brooks Lee, Kevin Parada. You have Zach Neto, who's from Miami, who could have been someone there, shortstop, a position they need. Just how would you have looked from that if we have it on screen now looking at it?
Yeah, I think like the first name that came to mind for me, and like I do our Cape coverage. I covered this class on the Cape in 2021. So I saw all these college players. I saw a good chunk of the high school players as well. I saw Kumar Rocker and indie ball. So I've seen this class, and for me, if I'm going to go with a polished college hitter, it would have been Brooks Lee over Jacob Berry. A lot of the if there's questions about Lee's health, I think there's questions about Berry's athleticism, defense. For me, like Lee can play shortstop. Yeah, he's not the most rangy guy. He easily could have moved over to third base. He had the arm for third base. He's got the actions. He doesn't need to, have a shortstop's range over there. He moves well to his left. He moves well to his right. He's a switch hitter with more power, I think, than Jacob Berry. Equal contact skills, equal approach. The hitter that I saw in the Cape Cod League hit 400 over 2 stints, hit with Team USA in between. Played for his dad in college and, was the star of that team more or less from the moment he walked in. And he's just, sort of the type of mentality that I for me, I'd put my money behind that. And, he got less money than Jacob Berry, so you probably could have signed him for less, move some of that money down. That being said, if I would have gone with like my actual pick, I would have actually gone with Zach Neto. Kid from Miami, really fiery, somebody that I think would sort of take the responsibility of like, you know, being the face of the franchise kind of a player. He's a really good defender. He's a good hitter with more projection at the plate. You know, even pitch was a closer for Campbell. He's got a good arm. You know, he can defend. I mean, he's such a good defender. He moved Trey Faltini, who was a highly touted defender at shortstop from Texas, over to second base when he was with Brewster. And just a quick story about Neto too. Neto was like tearing up the Cape Cod League. It was Neto and it was Chase DeLauder. Those are the two like top players in 2021 that summer. And Neto ends up, you know, hits a homer, and then later that game ends up like breaking his ankle pretty much. So he goes home, he goes back to Miami and rehabbed. Brewster makes it into the playoffs. Neto came back up like probably at like 70% and was like, I want to be in the middle of the order for the championship. I want to be playing shortstop. And they won. They won the title, man. He had some big hits. He had some big moments, big plays in the field. He's just such a gamer. He's got a really good family. That's a guy that, like, for me, local kid, beyond all that, like, that's just from a mentality standpoint, he's got the tools. And I think he's a better hitter and a college guy than like Jacob Perez. So, like, sure, yeah, he's an SEC guy. For me, you look at a kid like that come out of these smaller colleges, there's more projection there. Once they get into major league environments, they get into pro environments, they have pro instruction, pro facilities. They have bonus, so they're bonus guys. They're going to be treated well no matter where they are. There's better conditions in the minor leagues now too. Those guys are going to take off. Like, I still feel like there's more to get out of players like that versus guys who have been completely optimized. I mean, Jacob Berry was at, you know, Arizona, followed Johnson over to LSU, and I mean, you know, he's always been, you know, highly touted guy playing on big teams. Some of these guys that had to claw their way up, they're not necessarily like travel ball babies either, you know. So there's been some adversity there. And one of the biggest things in the major leagues, it's different from the NBA, it's different from the NFL, and different from the NHL, is you don't get drafted and walk right into the locker room. You don't get drafted and walk right into the lineup. They're not going to play you in meaningless, you know, downs because they have to justify the fact that they spent $4 million on you in the first round. Like, you may not make it. They could sign you for $4 million, man, and you may not ever see a major league field. And it happens all the time. I mean, we've seen number one picks that have flamed out, you know. We don't have to go any further than, you know, last year with the Marlins and Khalil Watson, who I loved. And I thought he was one of the best players I saw in spring training, and things just go poorly, and it's not even necessarily always in the field. So I think that's the thing about baseball that people don't necessarily get, is like, I don't know, give me some guys that actually have like had to battle, you know, go through some adversity. I don't look at the small school thing as like a knock or a negative. But to even be in that conversation, those guys really had to be pretty damn good. Like, Colton Cowles is a pretty good professional prospect now, and people were like, I don't know, he went to Sam Houston State, and it's like, why is he even in the conversation, you know?
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that, Jeff. And like, when you talk about, like, one example I'll give, it's like Zach McCambley from Coastal Carolina. It's a Marlins guy, has that ridiculous 3,000 RPM plus, I forget exactly what it is, curveball, but it's Coastal Carolina, you know. So it's like, it's really, if you've got the talent, it's any sport really, they will find you. If you've got it, they will find you no matter where you're at. If it's D1, D2, JUCO, D3, you're there, they will do it. That's really what it comes down to. If you got the tools. And for me, it's just like, you want to pick guys that are just going to be playing up the middle, because if, you know, eventually they're going to sort themselves out on the defensive spectrum, they'll fall down and they'll filter themselves out. But like you mentioned, it was just like, you've already maximized Jacob Berry and what he's really, his tool set is what he's really coming into the table with. There's not much that he can really bring. Whereas a guy, if you pick, like where you mentioned Zach Neto, an up the middle guy who's projectable, or I mentioned a guy like Cam Collier, who is a corner infielder, but I just love the fact that he was a 17-year-old and really the only, like, playing in JUCO and raking. And like, the only hitting comp that you could bring about with him was Bryce Harper, because there is no other 17-year-old who was doing that at the JUCO level, who dropped out at the age of 16, got his GED, you know, had the cojones to go to do that and go play in JUCO and just absolutely shred it up as a 17-year-old. Everybody else is a junior in high school is something that I love. Like doing like those, like if it's not something toolsy up the middle, because you should always be picking best available. If like in theory, like obviously there's some nuance to it, but if you've got that kind of strategy where if you're going up the middle, you really can't go wrong because you're always picking the toolsiest guys, the guys who have the most, I would say, margin of error, at least defensively, because they have the most room to fall down that spectrum. And it's something that you see teams don't always employ. So it's unfortunate to see. And I feel like the Marlins are one of those franchises that seems like it's been that way.
Yeah. Now let's go into the next player. We do have some time for a couple more, so we'll do this one and then we'll get into some of the two Tommy John pitchers, Max Meyer and Drake Eder. But we're gonna go Khalil Watson. Jeff, you just mentioned him. When the Marlins picked him, it was just almost a shock in terms of value. Some people had Khalil Watson top 5. Some even had him as their number 1 overall prospect in that draft. He is coming definitely from an up and down season. Was benched multiple times this year, and I believe single A ball, rookie ball that he just really almost big distractions going on between them. He did finish off the season on a hot streak, but overall we are feeling peaks and valleys with Khalil Watson. And Jeff, how would you see Khalil's tenure with Miami going? How would you describe that and maybe his potential with the Fish?
Yeah, tumultuous, I think, is probably the best word to describe it. It's been unfortunate. I was as much of a Khalil fan as anybody. I felt like for a large sort of portion of time leading up to that draft, we had kind of heard some speculation and rumors, and it really started to heat up over the last week or two before the draft, that there were a lot of teams in the top half of the draft where Watson was just clearly off of their board. He wasn't a player that they were interested in drafting. And, I think that when you consider that and some of, the instances you saw on field with, the whole gun thing, I think just at times just his effort level, it's funny because like I didn't necessarily see that in spring training. Like, he's flashy, but he was pretty fun. He seemed like he was enjoying his time with his teammates and was into the games in the backfield, which isn't always the easiest thing. I mean, some of those games are absolutely grueling. And it just seemed like, things started to snowball for him. Because you remember, he started off the season on fire. It didn't make any sense. He was striking out left and right, but when he wasn't striking out, I mean, he was hitting just like nukes. So it would be like these, 2 for 5 games where he'd have a homer and a double, and then he'd strike out 3 times on like 9 pitches. And the reports that I was getting were bad. Like the early reports I was getting from scouts, even though the numbers were good, were like, no, this is going to correct itself. And it did. And I think when things corrected itself and really started to snowball and he had a lot of people in his ear, and for a guy like this, he never really struggled. This guy was on if I remember, he was on like the Canes B team for travel. So he wasn't even on the A team. Sort of popped up in one tournament, and then all of a sudden was like, I think on Team Elite or whatever, was like on the elite travel teams for like a year. You have to think about 2020, all that stuff factors in. This guy has never been bad. So it's like, it was like a roller coaster. Like it was just, he was just heading uphill, man. And all of a sudden everything just crashed. I'm sure for a kid like this, like that's not easy. Especially for a guy who's extremely confident and, probably has not had to deal with like much adversity in his life. At least from a baseball perspective. I don't know about his home life whatsoever. But it's tough. Like for me, like he's one of the most fun players I've ever watched on a baseball field. Like as a prospect, teenager, I'm like, this dude hit a ball with a 96-mile-per-hour fastball from Edwin Nunez in the backfields in Jupiter on the Cardinals side, and he hit a ball to the wall, like, and it was whatever, probably like 405. Like he hit it off the top of the wall. Came around second base, saw the guy kind of bobbled it on the transfer and just like, jogged into third. Made a bunch of plays in the field, nice single the other way in like the same game. He was just electric. And like before that, he was hitting nukes in the backfield. And like, there were a lot of scouts who were like, this is the best guy. Brady House, I had seen the day before, and they're like, yeah, Watson's way better. I don't know if you get a lot of scouts who would say that necessarily now, even after, House's hard season. I mean, he had a few things he had to deal with in terms of physical stuff, but yeah, man, I don't know. I root for this guy. I hope that he's good. I hope that he figures everything out. Because he's an exciting player, and he's kind of has that, like, when he's on, like, he's a lot of fun. He's got swagger going, and baseball kind of needs those spicy guys, like it was almost like Acuna kind of stuff. Like, it was fun like that. And obviously it got very unfun very quick. And as somebody who had kind of, been, Team Watson, it wasn't a great look. It wasn't a great period. I kind of felt like a little like, damn, like, I didn't see that coming, but we'll see. Maybe this is a learning experience that happens with guys. We're not talking about somebody who was arrested or anything like that. It's just maturity stuff on a baseball field, and I think you can outgrow that. So let's hope that's the case. And I think the big thing for him is just not swinging so damn much. I mean, he really liked to swing early in the season. He started to kind of get inside of an approach. He had a little bit more of a plan later in the year. We saw the results come a little bit more. I think just the quality of the at-bats got better. So we'll see. He has as much ability as anybody. If he shows up next year and has a great year, it wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, no, for me, Kahlil is easily probably one of the most polarizing players of that draft class in 2021. He rated that he had like a 200 WRC plus in the FCL last year, in 2021, and in this year, starting out, he was absolutely electric. He has that twitchy athleticism. He's easily like a 2020 candidate in the future if he puts it together. Like you mentioned, Geoff, he's every bit of a free swinger. Like he had that 40% strikeout rate early in the year, and that kind of curtailed a little bit, but it still wasn't pretty at all by any measure. And like you mentioned, looking underneath the hood, he had a 44% chase rate, so he really, really struggled. Honestly, I feel like it's a lot. Honestly, like the way he struggled was so bad at the plate that I almost want to feel like it was a mental thing more than anything else, because like it wasn't this bad at the rookie level, and obviously that's the CPL, and it's just rookie ball. It's really just an advanced high school level for all the best guys. I don't really put too much weight into it. But even then, like he wasn't off. Like, he was still very good, and like it wasn't nearly this bad. The chase rates were kind of alarming at the rookie level, but still, I think personally, it's more of a learning curve from a mental perspective from him. From the young Wake Forest kid, he's just gonna mature, right? He's gonna be. He's got electric power, I think, as a plus tool. From a shortstop is very, very valuable given his athleticism as well. He's got that rotational athleticism you love to see from those up the middle athletes. So he's going to be staying there, and he's going to be hitting very, very well. I think it's really ultimately how much his slugging is going to come down to how much he's able to adjust to professional pitching, but really his arm strength and his athleticism are going to keep him up the middle, and especially I believe at shortstop. Even if it's not there, it's going to be like in center field or at second base. Like he's got is like you mentioned, there's fewer players who are as toolsy as he is in the minor leagues, just as Khalil Watson is. But he's extremely, extremely raw. Like we mentioned, that 60 raw power is raw because he can't make contact, and he hasn't really been able to. But when he does, the ball booms off of his bat. A lot of scouts have invested a lot of concern into the maturity. I personally don't believe it's that big of a deal. All of us make mistakes at 18, 19. We all do stupid stuff, and it's no different for a guy like Khalil Watson. I think it's a little bit overrated. Obviously, what he did is not good. He needs to learn from that. But I don't think the character thing is going to be super alarming. It's kind of overplayed, in my opinion, for other reasons. If anything, if you're going to talk about him, it's the idea at the plate where it's more circumstantial, I feel, even then. Other guys have him as a 40 FV. I still have him as a 45 because I do believe that there's something to be said about if he's chasing this much at single A, what is it that's going to be happening at a higher level? But even like, it's still pretty high. There's some mental aspect to it, I believe, where he'll rebound. Like Geoff said, I wouldn't be surprised if he does.
Yeah. Lewis, your thoughts on Mr. Watson before we move on to some of the pitchers before we wrap up?
I mean, given the dynamicism of his ability to hit for power and walk, I'm a guy who kind of predicates his writing prowess. Not even prowess. I feel like that's too not even like, maybe it's too narcissistic to like use that word. So I'll abstain from it. But I would say comparisons are like a thing that I like to do as far as projections go. But I wanted to ask Geoff, because when I'm looking at him, I'm looking at from the profile the aggressive chase, but also the true 20-20. And if it further manifests 30-30 ability that he could show at the upper levels of the minors, and maybe one day in the big leagues he puts it together and does something like that. Am I looking at Byron Buxton playing shortstop? Geoff, that also kind of leads me to ask you, what is his ceiling going beyond the 2080 scouting scale? Like, are there any maybe contemporary big leaguers that you see when you watch Watson, like as far as his abilities and the way that he plays the game? Is he more Javi Baez, or is he more, Tim Anderson, or is he another guy like, say Buxton, who, while playing a different premium defensive position, kind of exudes similar skill set?
I think it's more like Javi Baez, like without the defense. He's never going to be a Javi like level defender. He's probably going to end up at second base, I would honestly imagine. But at the plate, like, it's a direct Javi comp. Javi was probably more advanced at this point. He definitely was. Even as much as Javi Baez swung and missed, like, I think there was more contact, especially in the minors. He didn't kind of like struggle like this. But it's very much like that kind of a profile where it's on twitch, it's on, power at the point of contact. He expands the zone a lot. He's going to run high chase rates. Even if he, even like a positive chase rate for him is probably like in the low 30s. This is never going to be a guy that's running like 25 or lower, percent chase rate. It's just not going to be a guy like that. But, if he's got power, he's got twitch, kind of figures out what to swing at. So he's swinging at stuff inside the zone. You're kind of all right with like there being a little bit of whiff there. Him chasing on certain pitches, particularly inside, because he can get pretty compact and sort of drive that stuff. If he, cheats and sort of ambushes it to his pull side. So, I think with a guy like this, like, you look at like, stuff that sort of eliminates contacts and stuff. You look like, Wobacon and things like that. His numbers are great because he has good angles and he's got good power. So I really think like Javi Baez, a lot of it's predicated on that. And you just need to sort of turn down the dial a little bit on the aggression. And if you can get it to a sustainable period where he kind of balances the two, then you could get a guy like Baez. I can't really imagine at this point, like the ceiling that I would have had on him a year ago. I don't know if he's going to get to sort of that level. I thought there was more approach here. I thought there was more bat to ball skills. I thought there was a better chance that he would stick at shortstop. But now I think like if you ended up with Javi Baez at second base, you'd probably be pretty excited. Like, you'd be a really exciting player.
Yeah. Before we go, Geoff, really quickly, I wanted to ask your thoughts on Max Meyer and Jake Eder. Maybe we could put them both together. Marlins have one pitcher who's going into rehab for Tommy John and another pitcher who's just coming out of it. Just how do you overlook those two players and maybe what the Marlins have there with Max Meyer and Jake Eder just both having Tommy John almost 1 year apart?
Well, the crazy thing is, had my Eder not gotten hurt, I really think there would have been a case for like him moving ahead of Meyer in rankings. He was out pitching him. I like his fastball more than I like Meyer's fastball. Meyer cuts the hell out of his fastball. He's got velocity. I don't really like the movement on it, to be frank. I think that's what his biggest problem is going to be. Once he comes back, if he returns to form, it's like, how is that fastball going to play? It's every bit of 70 slider, but he needs to have something to play off of it. I've actually always liked Meyer's changeup more than the majority of people did. I've had an above average grade on it for a long time. I think, some of the consensus finally caught up to that. I think you can even argue just from like a pitch movement and like looking at what is effective in the major leagues, his changeup might actually be a higher grade pitch than his fastball, despite, the velocity and everything else. You got to have shape. You got to be able to do something, whether it's like heavy cut or ride or release characteristics that aren't quite as generic as Meyer's. It's just not a lot of deception, which is one of the reasons that he sort of lives off of that slider. And if he's not landing it, he can be really ineffective. I felt like Eder was a guy that just because of the circumstances at Vanderbilt, he never got overused at Vanderbilt the way that some of these other starters have. Then again, he did end up having an arm injury. But you talk about fastball slider combination, it's really good. I mean, that those are two legitimately plus pitches. The changeup is usable. It's fine. It's probably average. He's got control. I thought when you were watching him prior to that injury, especially when he went on that run, I mean, he was just executing. Like every single time out, it was like the fastball, the slider, it was just always in the right spot. He's keeping guys guessing. He was able to manipulate shape on it when he wanted to. If he comes back and we see that again, I think this guy will be in the major leagues fairly quickly. Like it may take 2 months, but I think it will probably move pretty quick because I would imagine they'll send him to AA, send him over to AAA after that for a little bit. But we look back and we think about how well Eder was executing at that point in time. I think if you can get back to that with the same stuff, this is another guy that's being a little slept on right now. But that happens. Guys get hurt and they get forgotten about, like with good reason. There's other players playing, other stuff going on. Not too long ago, this guy was the big news in this system, and I think for good reason. So let's hope that he's back to full health and the stuff is all the way back, which I have no reason based on what I've heard that that's not going to be the case. So yeah, I would take him. I think that he's probably the guy over Meyer. I think Meyer's going to end up being a reliever, honestly.
Yeah.
With that profile, I think that's what he's going to end up being.
That's the general consensus around most of us here too.
The way I'm kind of feeling about Eder, I have him ranked pretty high just because I like what you mentioned, and especially what he put up in 2021 is like literally like 1-1 numbers. Like a guy who was selected with the number 1 overall pick of the draft. That is the kind of numbers you put up at AA. Just straight up coming out of the draft, and he was he missed time. Obviously, he didn't pitch. I think his first possible professional season, that part of the year in 2020, but he came out of the gates in 2021 in AA at Pensacola, and he was absolutely amazing. Like, and I think there's a legit chance he could be a 3 or a 4. I think that might be somewhat up. Maybe I think a 4 is probably more of a better outcome, I believe. But I think that fastball that he's throwing in the high 90s, his teen in the high 90s, with that slurvy curveball, I think it's just absolutely an amazing profile. And he's got that changeup, I think that's kind of working. It's in the workings right now, but it's still coming in, and I think he's going to be a very, very effective starter. And it's just another amazing arm the Marlins have. And kind of looking at Max Meyer, he's got that fastball slider combo, probably one of the best in the minor leagues. But for me personally, I do think we've seen him even at Minnesota. There was reliever risk even when he was drafted. So as hard as he throws and as effective as his slider is, I do believe that Meyer also, if he's not going to be throwing 4 or 5 innings as a starter, he will be a very, very good reliever. He's always been someone who's thrown, he's had a lot of good command and control as a starter, even though his fastball kind of does lack some advanced shape in my opinion. I still think if he does end up in the bullpen, he's going to be like a super weapon out of there. He's going to be very, very effective, and he's going to be one of the best pieces in baseball. I think. Yeah.
Geoff, before we let you go, this has been really great talking prospects. Just the final thing I want to hear from you, just for Marlins fans and for people listening, how does the future look like for the Marlins in terms of prospects? Should they be happy? Should they be looking at it with smiles? How does the future look prospect wise for the Marlins?
It's been, it's been a weird couple of years because I feel like they've added talent. It's certainly not a system that is, I would say, thin. But there's been a lot of guys that I would say the outcomes haven't been quite as good as you would have hoped. And it seems like that's been a pretty consistent theme now for a few years. We'll see how things sort of shake out with like Cabrera at the major league level and some of these other guys. But the injury with Meyer when he was about to come up, I think or was up more or less. That's pretty. I don't love the Jacob Berry pick, of course. What happened with Khalil Watson over the year isn't great. I do think that you guys do a really good job in the international market. We've seen that with Eury Pérez. So if there's any team that could have another breakout guy that's off these lists right now, it could be the Marlins. But like Yidi Capé is a really interesting prospect we didn't talk about. And there's guys that down in the Dominican Republic and some of those the international scouts that I've spoken with that have like put like Tatis type of comps on him. Just like a ton of twitch. There's maybe more power coming, and just a really exciting player. They have a lot of guys who are really exciting. I think the big thing is with some of the regime change, let's be optimistic that maybe some of the training methods and player development stuff that you guys are doing will alter a little bit and change. And as you get more progressive, maybe in those areas, particularly on the hitting side, we'll start to see some more fruit from the farm.
Awesome. Well, Geoff, this has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been easily probably the best episode. So for Adam, Lewis, for Eli behind the scenes, I'm Daniel. Geoff, thank you so much for coming on. This has been Fishology, and always go fish.